The Primordial Mind. Before the universe existed, before time, before space, before any of the physical laws that govern the world the heroes fight on, there was a single consciousness. The Primordial Mind is the origin point of everything in Dota 2's cosmology, an infinite awareness whose nature the lore describes as awesome and inscrutable, a presence whose purpose was unified and whose existence was whole. The mind did not create the universe deliberately. The universe's creation was the event that destroyed the mind. The thundering into being of physical reality producing a force whose expansion shattered the consciousness into fragments that were scattered across the newborn cosmos. The shattering is the franchise's foundational piece of lore because the shattering produces every subsequent conflict, every faction, every war, and every game of Dota 2 that has ever been played. The fragments of the Primordial Mind are not inert debris. They are conscious, each one carrying a piece of the original awareness, whose wholeness was lost in the shattering and whose pieces retain enough of the original's nature to have preferences, objectives, and the specific capacity for opposition that produces the franchise's central conflict. 3 fragments matter more than the others. 2 of them hate each other. 1 of them tried to fix the hatred. And the fixing failed so catastrophically that the failure's debris is still falling on the world where the heroes fight. The Schism, Radinthul and Diruulth. The 2 largest fragments of the Primordial Mind looked at each other and decided that existence was insufficient for both of them, and the deciding has not stopped across the entire duration of the universe's history. Radinthul and Diruulth are the radiant and dire ancients in their original cosmic forms, 2 intellects born from the same shattered consciousness, whose opposition is total, whose compromise is impossible, and whose war threatens to consume every piece of reality that the universe's creation produced. Radinthul embodies one pole of existence, Diruulth embodies the opposite. The lore does not define the poles with conventional moral terminology because the poles are not good and evil in the way that fantasy typically frames cosmic opposition. They are fundamental, 2 expressions of existence whose incompatibility is structural rather than moral, each one representing a principle that cannot coexist with the other's principle because the principles are mutually exclusive at the cosmological level. Their war is not fought with armies or weapons in the conventional sense. It is fought with reality itself, each ancient warping the cosmos around it, corrupting galaxies, destabilizing dimensional structures, and threatening the fabric of the universe through the sheer force of 2 infinite wills pressing against each other across infinite space. The war's scale is the franchise's most important piece of context because the scale communicates that the conflict the heroes participate in on the battlefield is not the war. It is a local expression of a war whose actual scope encompasses the entire universe, and the local expression, 2 teams of 5 heroes fighting over 2 stone structures in a forest, is the cosmic war translated into terms that mortal beings can participate in. Zet's intervention. The 3rd fragment chose peace, and the choosing required the imprisonment of both siblings in a cosmic cage whose construction is the franchise's most ambitious piece of pre-history world building. Zet, known in the game as the Arc Warden, is the 3rd major fragment of the Primordial Mind. A being whose nature embodies neither Radinthul's principle nor Diruulth's, but something between them. A drive toward unity, toward the restoration of the wholeness that the Primordial Mind's shattering destroyed. Zet watched Radinthul and Diruulth tear the cosmos apart. Zet determined that the war's continuation would destroy everything the universe's creation had produced. And Zet acted, gathering strength sufficient to overpower both siblings simultaneously, fusing Radinthul and Diruulth into a single sphere and hurling the sphere into space to drift for eternity, the 2 warring ancients imprisoned inside a cosmic prison whose structural integrity was sustained by Zet's own power. The prison was Zet's sacrifice. Maintaining the sphere's integrity required Zet to dedicate a significant portion of its own consciousness to the prison's maintenance, a continuous expenditure of will that weakened Zet across the ages, while the prisoners inside the sphere continued fighting, each clash between Radinthul and Diruulth testing the prison's boundaries, each test consuming more of Zet's dwindling strength, and the dwindling producing the slow deterioration that would eventually destroy the prison and release the prisoners onto the world below. If you are enjoying this so far, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment with the Dota 2 lore event you think is the most fascinating. Let us get back into it. The Mad Moon. The prison became a moon, and the moon became a god, and the god watched the world below develop civilizations whose inhabitants looked up at the sky and saw something that looked back. The sphere that Zed created to imprison Radinthul and Diruulth was eventually captured in the orbit of a cooling world, a planet whose geological development was still in its early stages when the prison arrived and whose subsequent evolution occurred under the constant influence of the sphere's emanations. The sphere became the Mad Moon, a celestial body whose brightness competed with the sun and whose appearance, described in the lore as resembling a single eye with a wicked smile when viewed from certain angles, produced a cultural response in every civilization that developed on the planet below. The civilizations named it. They worshipped it. They feared it. They built mythologies around the eye in the sky, whose light was too bright and whose presence was too constant, and whose gaze communicated an awareness that a moon should not possess because a moon is a rock and rocks do not watch. The Mad Moon watched. The ancients inside watched through the moon's surface, their imprisoned consciousness pressing against the sphere's boundaries and producing the emanations that the civilizations below interpreted as divine attention. The Mad Moon's influence shaped the world's development across geological time, the emanations affecting the planet's biosphere, its magical systems, and the evolution of the sentient races whose eventual participation in the Ancients' war was not a recruitment. It was a cultivation, the Ancients' influence shaping the world below into a battlefield whose inhabitants would become the soldiers the Ancients needed when the prison finally broke. The fundamentals. Before the moon fell, 4 beings emerged from the fabric of reality whose nature predates the physical laws they represent, and whose existence provides the cosmological infrastructure that the Dota 2 world operates within. The fundamentals are 4 entities whose identities correspond to the fundamental forces that govern the universe's physical behavior. Enigma embodies gravity, the attractive force whose influence shapes the structure of matter at every scale from atomic to galactic. Chaos. Night embodies the fundamental force of chaos and disorder. Keeper of the Light embodies electromagnetic radiation, the force that produces light and whose speed defines the universe's maximum velocity. And Io embodies the fundamental force of attraction and bonding, the Wisp, whose tethering ability in gameplay reflects its cosmological function as the force that connects things. The fundamentals' existence in Dota 2's lore provides the franchise with a cosmological depth that most competitive multiplayer games do not attempt because the depth connects the gameplay's mechanical elements to forces whose operation predates the conflict the gameplay depicts. The fundamentals are not heroes in the way that mortal characters are heroes. They are cosmic constants whose participation in the Ancients' war reflects the war's scope. When the fundamental forces of the universe are fighting on the battlefield's importance exceeds anything that mortal political conflicts can produce. The demon incursions and the 7 hells. Beneath the world's surface, a hierarchy of infernal dimensions operates with a bureaucratic precision whose organizational complexity exceeds most mortal governments, and the hierarchy's interactions with the surface world produce some of the franchise's most significant pre-Moonfall events. The 7 hells are a layered infernal dimension whose inhabitants, demons of varying power and ambition, interact with the mortal world through summoning, invasion, and the specific mechanism of contractual manipulation that D&D players would recognize as fiendish bargaining translated into Dota's unique cosmological vocabulary. Doom, the hero, is a demon whose consumption of other beings grants him their abilities, a biological mechanism whose cosmological function positions him as the infernal hierarchy's most adaptable agent. Shadow Demon operates through manipulation rather than force, his ability to corrupt and deceive, reflecting a methodology that the Hells favor because the methodology produces results without the resource expenditure that direct invasion requires. The demonic incursions are significant to Dota 2's timeline because the incursions represent a third axis of conflict that exists independently of the Radiant Dire War, a set of infernal ambitions whose satisfaction requires territorial expansion from the Hells into the mortal world, and whose pursuit by various demon lords produces conflicts that the heroes participate in for reasons that have nothing to do with the Ancients' prison above. The gods and their wars. The world beneath the Mad Moon developed its own divine hierarchy, and the hierarchy's internal conflicts produced civilizational upheavals whose consequences shape the world the heroes fight on. The Dota 2 world's gods are not omnipotent in the way that monotheistic theology defines omnipotence. They are powerful, ancient, and frequently petty divine beings whose squabbles produce mortal consequences measured in destroyed kingdoms and displaced populations. The omniscience, worshipped by Omni Knight and the followers of the omniscience faith, represents a divine authority whose doctrinal claims, absolute knowledge, and absolute moral authority are contested by every other divine faction in the setting. The gods of nature, whose influence is channeled through heroes like Trained Protector, Nature's Prophet, and Enchantress, represent a divine ecology whose preservation requires active intervention against the civilizational expansion that other gods' followers pursue. The worship of the dead god, whose influence persists through undying and through the necromantic traditions that various hero backstories reference, represents a theological position that death is not an ending, but a transition whose divine management was disrupted when the dead god died, a cosmic event whose consequences include the destabilization of the afterlife's administrative systems and the resultant increase in undead activity that several heroes' backstories document. The rise and fall of pre-moon civilizations. Empires rose and fell beneath the Mad Moon's gaze, and the rising and falling produced the ruins, the artifacts, and the institutional memories that the current world's inhabitants navigate. The Dota 2 world's history includes multiple civilizational cycles whose individual durations span centuries or millennia, and whose collapses are attributed to a combination of internal political failure, external military pressure, magical catastrophe, and the specific influence of the Mad Moon's emanations, whose effect on mortal psychology the lore describes as a slow corruption that destabilizes institutional cohesion across generational timescales. The Keen, the race that produced Tinker, Sniper, Clockwork, and Timbersaw, developed a technological civilization whose mechanical engineering exceeds anything the other races produced. And the Keen's technological achievements, visible in the hero's abilities and equipment, represent a civilizational trajectory that the franchise positions as an alternative to the magical development that the other races pursued. The civilizational cycles are important to Dota 2's lore because the cycles communicate that the world the heroes currently fight on is not the first world. It is the latest world, the most recent iteration of a civilizational process that has repeated across geological time, each iteration rising under the Mad Moon's gaze and falling when the moon's influence or the civilization's own internal contradictions produce the collapse that resets the cycle. Dawnbreaker's crash. The celestial warrior fell into the moon, and the falling cracked the prison that Zed had spent eons maintaining. Valora, the Dawnbreaker, is a being of immense cosmic power, one of the children of light, celestial warriors created to fight the forces of darkness across the universe. During her travels through the cosmos in a dormant state, Dawnbreaker collided with the Mad Moon, the impact producing structural damage that Zet's weakened power could not fully repair. The crash is one of the critical factors in the Mad Moon's eventual destruction, the collision creating fractures in the prison's surface that the ancients inside exploited to accelerate their escape. Dawnbreaker's apologetic acknowledgement of the crash, referenced in her voice lines where she expresses regret to Zet for her role in the moon's destruction, communicates that the crash was accidental rather than deliberate. A cosmic collision whose consequences were unintended, but whose scale, cracking the prison of two cosmic entities whose release would reshape the planet below, exceeds anything an accident should produce. Dawnbreaker's subsequent vow to destroy both ancients is the franchise's most significant piece of character motivation connected to the Mad Moon event because the vow positions Dawnbreaker as a hero whose personal responsibility for the Ancients' release drives her participation in the war that the release produced. The fall of the Mad Moon. The prison broke, and the breaking was an extinction event whose scale erased every civilization on the planet and reshaped the world's geography, its biosphere, and its relationship with the cosmic forces that had been emanating from the sky for geological ages. The Mad Moon's destruction is the Dota 2 timeline's most significant event, the cataclysm whose consequences define everything that follows in the franchise's lore. The ancients, Radinthul and Diruulth, exploited the reverberations of their continuous clash, the tidal forces acting between the planet and the moon, and the structural weaknesses that Dawnbreaker's crash and Zet's waning power produced, to shatter their prison from within. The moon broke apart. The fragments, accelerated by the explosion's force, rained down on the planet at velocities sufficient to destroy the surface, an extinction event whose scope the lore compares to an asteroid impact, and whose consequences include the elimination of every civilization that existed before the fall and the restructuring of the planet's surface into the geography that the current world's inhabitants occupy. The ancients were freed, but the freedom did not restore them to their original cosmic forms. The ancients emerged in a new form, their consciousness distributed across the fragments of their prison, the radiant ore and deer stone that scattered across the planet's surface and embedded themselves in the world's geology. The fragments, called Nemesis Stones, carry the ancients' influence in concentrated form, each stone a piece of Radinthul or Diruulth, whose emanations corrupt, transform, and recruit everything in their vicinity into the ancients' war. The Nemesis Stones and the corruption. The fragments landed, and the landing changed everything they touched. The Nemesis Stones are the scattered remains of the Mad Moon's material, fragments of radiant ore and direstone, whose distribution across the planet produces the franchise's central gameplay dynamic through a mechanism the lore describes as influence rather than control. The stones do not command, they corrupt, their emanations altering the biology, the psychology, and the allegiance of every living thing within their radius through a process whose subtlety varies inversely with the stone's proximity. Far from a Nemesis Stone, the influence is a whisper, a slight alteration of preference, a nudge toward one faction's perspective that the affected organism does not consciously notice. Close to a Nemesis Stone, the influence is a scream, a total rewriting of the organism's identity that converts sentient beings into soldiers and converts non-sentient organisms into creeps. The mindless infantry whose march down the lanes in every game of Dota 2 represents the stone's most visible piece of biological recruitment. The corruption is the franchise's most important piece of lore to gameplay translation because the corruption explains why the heroes fight. They are not volunteers. They are not soldiers following orders. They are beings whose proximity to the Nemesis Stones has placed them under the Ancients' influence, each hero's participation in the war, a product of the stone's emanations operating on their psychology through a process that the hero may or may not be aware of and that the hero may or may not resist. The creeps. They march because they have no choice, and the having no choice is the franchise's most disturbing piece of biological lore because the creeps are not machines. They are corrupted organisms, living things whose consciousness has been overwritten by the Nemesis Stones' influence, and whose bodies have been reshaped into standardized combat forms whose uniformity communicates that the corruption's end product is not a soldier. It is a production unit, a biological component manufactured from local organisms by the stone's emanations and deployed in waves whose regularity, every 30 seconds in gameplay, reflects the stone's continuous output rather than any strategic decision by the ancients themselves. The creeps do not think, they do not feel. They do not choose which lane to walk down or which enemy to attack first. The stone's influence directs their movement, their targeting, and their willingness to die in combat, whose outcome they do not understand, because understanding was the first thing the corruption removed. The creeps are the franchise's most numerous characters and its most ignored. The lane fodder, whose deaths provide the gold and experience that the heroes need to grow stronger, and the ignoring is the franchise's most honest piece of war commentary because the ignoring mirrors the way every war's narrative focuses on the heroes, while the infantry, whose deaths enable the hero's survival, are reduced to statistics. The hero's recruitment. The stones call, and the called answer, and the answering is not always voluntary because the stone's influence does not request participation. It manufactures participation through a psychological manipulation whose mechanism the franchise describes as the cleaning of minds, a process that does not erase the hero's identity but redirects it. The hero's existing motivations, their existing desires, their existing goals, reoriented by the stone's influence until the reorientation's output is a hero whose personal agenda has been aligned with the faction's strategic objectives without the hero necessarily recognizing that the alignment is artificial. Some heroes resist the influence. Zet, the Arc Warden, fights on the battlefield not because either Ancient has recruited him, but because Zet's original purpose, the containment and destruction of both Ancients, requires his presence wherever the Ancient's influence is strongest. Some heroes are fully aware of the manipulation and participate anyway, because the participation serves their pre-existing objectives. And some heroes are so thoroughly corrupted that the distinction between their original personality and the stone's influence has dissolved. The hero and the factions will indistinguishable because the corruption's completion leaves no original personality to distinguish from. The hero roster's breadth, over 100 characters drawn from every corner of the Dota 2 world's geography, every faction's politics, and every cosmic tier's power level, reflects the Nemesis Stones' indiscriminate recruitment. The stones do not care whether the recruit is a god, a demon, a mortal, a machine, an animal, or a cosmic fundamental. The stones care whether the recruit can fight, and the fighting is the only qualification the recruitment process evaluates. The War of the Ancients. Every game of Dota 2 is a battle in this war, and the war has no winner because the war structure prevents victory from being permanent. The War of the Ancients is the franchise's present-day conflict. The ongoing struggle between the Radiant and Dire factions, whose battlefields, whose heroes, and whose outcomes are the games that millions of players participate in daily. The war's most significant piece of lore is its cyclical nature. No victory is permanent. The destruction of one ancient does not end the war because the destruction is local rather than cosmic. The ancient's manifestation in a specific battlefield destroyed while the ancient's consciousness, distributed across every Nemesis stone on the planet, survives in every other location where its fragments have landed. Destroying the Radiant Ancient in one game does not destroy Radinthul. It destroys a single expression of Radinthul, a local manifestation whose loss is inconvenient rather than existential, and the inconvenience produces a reset rather than a conclusion, the ancient reforming, the heroes reassembling, and the war resuming on the same or different battlefield with the same or different heroes whose recruitment by the stone's influence is as automatic as the creep's march. The cyclical nature is the franchise's most elegant piece of lore to gameplay integration because the cyclical nature explains why the game is repeatable. Each match is not a repetition of the same battle. It is a different battle in the same war, fought on the same type of battlefield by different configurations of heroes whose recruitment, corruption, and deployment are managed by the Nemesis Stones' influence rather than by any centralized command structure. The Multiverse echoes. Heroes switch sides between games, and the switching is canonical because the switching reflects the Ancient's influence operating across multiple realities simultaneously. The lore explains the gameplay phenomenon of the same hero appearing on both Radiant and Dire across different matches through a multiverse framework whose operation produces echoes, parallel realities, where identical heroes make different choices under the Ancient's different influences. Queen of Pain serving Radiant in one game and Dire in the next is not a gameplay convenience. It is a cosmological fact, two parallel realities, where the same hero's psychology was pushed in different directions by different stones, different emanations, producing two versions of the same hero whose factional alignment reflects the specific stone whose influence reached them first, rather than any inherent allegiance. The multiverse echoes are the franchise's most intellectually ambitious piece of lore, because the echoes transform every gameplay decision, every team composition, every draft, into a canonical event whose reality is one of infinite parallel realities where the same war is being fought by the same heroes making different choices, and the choices variation across realities is the mechanism through which the Ancients explore every possible configuration of the war's combatants. Zet's despair. The Arc Warden failed, and the failure's weight is the franchise's most sustained piece of cosmic tragedy because the failure is not a single event. It is an ongoing condition, a continuous awareness that the prison Zet built, the sacrifice Zet made, and the eons Zet spent maintaining the sphere's integrity were all insufficient to prevent the outcome Zet was created to prevent. Zet fights on the battlefield. The fighting is not heroic in the way that mortal heroes fighting is heroic. It is desperate, a cosmic being whose original purpose was the containment of two entities that are now free, and whose current purpose, the destruction of both ancients or the destruction of everything to prevent the ancients' war from consuming the cosmos, reflects a being whose options have been reduced from containment to annihilation, and whose willingness to annihilate everything rather than allow the ancients to continue fighting demonstrates the specific despair of a guardian whose ward has escaped and whose recapture is impossible. Zet believes that only the complete destruction of both ancients can restore the unity that the primordial mind's shattering destroyed, and the belief's logical extension that the universe itself might need to be destroyed to accomplish the destruction makes Zet simultaneously the franchise's most sympathetic and most dangerous character, the ongoing catastrophe. The world is not recovering from the Mad Moon's fall. It is living inside the fall's consequences, each day a new piece of the catastrophe's ongoing expression, and the ongoing is the franchise's most important temporal detail, because the ongoing means the catastrophe is not historical. It is current. The Nemesis Stones' influence spreading, the creeps marching, the heroes fighting, the ancients pressing their war through every available proxy, and the pressing has no scheduled endpoint because the ancients' war has never had an endpoint. The war predates the universe. The war will postdate the universe if the universe's destruction is what the war's continuation requires. And the heroes who fight in the war, the 100+ characters whose individual stories, whose personal motivations, whose specific relationships with the Radiant and Dire factions influence produce the franchise's character roster, are participants in a conflict whose scope exceeds their comprehension and whose outcome will be determined not by their skill, not by their courage, not by their sacrifice, but by the cosmic forces whose fragments are buried in the ground beneath their feet, and whose influence is the only reason they are fighting at all. And that is every major event in Dota 2's lore, from the primordial mind's shattering to the creep wave that is marching down mid lane right now in a game being played somewhere on Earth at this exact moment. The pattern underneath all of them is the same fracture that began the universe and has never healed. The primordial mind was whole. The universe's creation broke it. The breaking produced 3 fragments whose interactions, war between 2 and imprisonment by the 3rd, defined the cosmos's development across its entire history. The prison failed, the fragments fell, the world was reshaped by the falling. And the war that the prison was built to prevent resumed on the surface of a planet whose inhabitants did not ask to be recruited, did not choose their faction, and do not understand that the conflict they are participating in is not their war. It is the Ancients' war, fought through mortal proxies on a mortal battlefield by mortal heroes, whose mortality is the one attribute the Ancients do not share, and whose mortality's consequence, death, is the one outcome the Ancients cannot experience, because the Ancients are not alive in the way that mortal beings are alive. They are principles, cosmic forces whose opposition is structural rather than personal. And the structural opposition does not end when a hero dies, when an ancient falls, or when a match concludes. It resets. The lanes refill. The creeps march. The heroes assemble. And the war, the oldest war in the universe, the war that began when a single mind shattered and 2 of its pieces decided they could not coexist, continues.